him about it. And and Ben Zak and Yochanan ben Zakkai asks the Roman whether he believes in exorcism, and the Roman says yes, he does. Well, then Yochanan says to the Roman, that's what the rite of the red heifer is. It's a kind of exorcism. It expels unclean spirits, and the Roman is satisfied, and he goes away. Then Ben Zakkai's students turn to Rabban Yochanan and say, you gave him an answer that will satisfy a Roman, but what will you answer us? In other words, there has to be a much better explanation than that. And Yochanan answers them and he says, you should know that it is not death that defiles or the ritual that terrifies. Rather, God is saying, I have established a statute and instituted a decree, and you have no permission to transgress from it. Period. In other words, yes, it's true that there are things we don't understand, and we still need to abide by them. What is this midrash telling us? First, that not only do we find the laws of purity hard to understand, but so did the rabbis. But they still abided by them. But let's not misunderstand Rabban Yochanan's reply to his students. It's often been taken to mean that the laws, which we call chukim or statutes, have no reason, or at least none that we can understand. Rav Sadia Gaon of the 9th century says that the statutes are commands given to us by God simply to reward us for obeying them, not because they have any intrinsic logic. In contrast, Maimonides, Rambam, in the late 12th century, disagrees and maintains that every command has a reason, even the chukim, the statutes. So there is a machloket, there is a controversy amongst the rabbis about these laws that we don't understand. And Rambam basically says you have to seek the rationale and go for it because there is a rationale, whereas Sadia Gaon says there may not be a rationale, but it comes from God, and if we are faithful, we follow them. Now we get to the statutes themselves. Vayikra's purity laws, which are set out in chapters 11 through 16, follow a distinct order, and they speak about impurity and how it can be contracted. They can be contracted with repulsive animals, and there is a whole list of those. Impurity can be contracted in childbirth, and we're going to get to that specifically. Contact with tsara'at or leprosy, which in fact, as Maimonides points out, is a generic name for a whole variety of skin conditions. Skin conditions in humans. Tsara'at is also discoloration of garments from skin conditions and other impurities. Mildew on the walls of houses is also considered tsara'at. Contact with impure clothes, so if you have touched the garments of that are considered tsara'at, then you too have contact with impurity. Bodily fluids such as menstrual blood or various male discharges. These laws are followed by chapter 16, which specify the rights of the high priest on Yom Kippur, and the connection between this and the purity laws is described in terms of defilement and atonement in the process of purification. Following that are the great holiness codes of chapter 18 through 20, which are about forbidden sexual relations, incest, etc. And they are forbidden specifically to the Israelites because, according to the text, they are holy people in a holy land. Now, according to the ancient rabbis, there are also ethical sins which can cause defilement or sara'at, which is a kind of moral leprosy. These are, there's a whole bunch of them: serving idols, promiscuity, murder, not accidental or unintentional killing, but murder, blaspheming God through evil behavior or speech, lashon hora. Indeed, the rabbis made an acronym of mitzora, which or tzara'at, which comes this double portion, and they said that it was an acronym for mem tzadi resh mitzora, for motzi ra, emitting evil verbally. The ancient rabbis in the time of the Mishnah and the Talmud, between 1800 and 1500 years ago, taught that sara'at, or leprosy, or skin disease, was not a bodily disease, but a physical manifestation of a spiritual disease. Not unlike what fundamentalist Christians did in the early days, and some of them still do, around AIDS, that AIDS was a manifestation of spiritual disease and sexual promiscuity or impropriety. They believed that it was a punishment for speaking, medaber, slander against others. They said that the Hebrew word mitzorah is actually a contraction of motzi ra, one who emits evil, or one who speaks or spreads slander, or, as in the Holiness Code, one who engages in improper sexual behavior. What happens to one who is in that category? They must be severely punished, and according to the book of Leviticus, must be cut off from his or her kin. This means excommunication, symbolically or actually cut off, cast off into the midbar, into the desert. And many rabbis have done word plays around this, that the evil speech is from midaber, and they are cast out into the wilderness, into the midbar, into the desert. Other forms of ethical tsara'at are corrupting justice and law, taking a vain oath, unfair or prejudicial judgment, false testimony, causing quarrels, discord, and violence. So notice how many of them are associated with speech. Chilul Hashem, the desecration of the name of God, verbal blasphemy of other sorts, vain oaths, prejudicial statements, false testimony, causing quarrels, discord, or violence. On Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah, when we beat our chests and when we do the confessionals, just pay attention to how many of those are sins of speech, sins of the mouth. You'll notice that many of them are. Okay, so how do we understand the laws of purity and impurity? Rabbi Jonathan Sacks helps us. He says the laws of purity exist because of the extreme paradox of the sanctuary, of the Mishkan, and later the temple. Recall that until the sin of the golden calf, God had been transcendent, not immanent. God had been distant, not close, creator of the universe, shaper of history, and liberator of slaves. The sanctuary and its service put all of this potentiality at risk. To speak of God as having a home on earth, or smelling the sweet savor of burnt offerings, is from a theological perspective very dangerous. Reach nichoach, to smell the aroma of the burnt offerings, or in the Mishkan, build me a Mishkan, ki shachanti betocham, so that I might dwell within them, makes God much more immanent, makes God close and near. So Rabbi Sacks goes on and he says, yet God listened to Moses' prayer for an immanent God. God understood that the Israelites needed to feel that God was in their midst, um, and that that God might dwell within them. Shachanti b'tocham. The answer, therefore, lay in bringing God closer, but establishing boundaries, demarcated lines, rigorously supervised by the priests and fastidiously observed by all. Remember that last week we talked a lot about boundaries. We talked about the kind of boundaries of sacrifice and so on. This is what is happening here. If the holy is the space we make for God, then purity is what allows us to enter that space, and impurity is what prevents us to do so. And that's why in the laws of purity and impurity, the solution or the remedy for impurity is to isolate the individual, to cut that person away from the community for a certain period of time until they are deemed pure. Hence, the supreme source of impurity, the ultimate condition of impurity, is death, contact with or proximity to a dead body. Paradoxically, childbirth defiles, even though it represents new life. The reason may be that until quite recently it was a hazard to give birth. Babies were stillborn, many died young, and many mothers died giving birth. The very loss of blood was dangerous, so childbirth may defile because it is an encounter with the risk of death. Likewise, the flow of menstrual blood and the reproductive cycle is a sign of human mortality. It may be that the appearance of menstrual blood, the monthly cycle, was a sign that the woman was not pregnant, so it represented a kind of death of the unfertilized egg and the possibility of a new life. Seminal and other discharges likewise defiled because they too were a sign of the body functioning in what they considered to be non-normal ways. Since the ultimate imperative was puru uruvu, be fruitful and multiply. Skin disease is the most publicly visible reminder of our physicality. The skin condition called tzara'at was regarded as another particularly acute sign of mortality, of disease, and decay. A leprous individual is like one who is dead, say the sages. What connects the different types of tzara'at, garments, mildew on the walls of houses, and skin, is that they themselves are boundaries between inside and outside, and holiness depends on the health and the strength of the boundaries. Holiness and purity depend on the ability to distinguish, separate, and know what belongs where. The same logic applies to sexual ethics in a more profound way. Nothing is more destructive of a social order in the long run than sexual lack of order or ethical boundaries and standards. Judaism is neither hedonistic nor ascetic. It is about the consecration of desire. That is what is at heart of the two codes of forbidden sexual relations in chapters 18 and 20. God does not ask us to sacrifice or devalue our physicality. To the contrary, we are part of the physical world, and this is where God wants us to serve. Nonetheless, lines have to be drawn and boundaries maintained between God's domain and ours. Failure to observe the boundary between the permitted and the forbidden caused the first human beings, Adam and Eve, to be exiled. And within a generation, the Torah text tells us, the first murder had taken place, and before long, Haaretz maleh Hamas, the earth was filled with violence. This is the Torah's form of what Rabbi Sachs calls chaos theory. As the beating of a butterfly, this is his words now, as the beating of a butterfly's wings is said to cause a typhoon on the other side of the earth, so small breaches of boundaries can lead in time to anarchy and tyranny. Knowing how rapid the descent can be from civilization to barbarism, the priestly sensibility is vigilant in maintaining what the poet Wallace Stevens called the blessed rage of order. The blessed rage of order. So let's look at some specifics of Parashat Tazria. And there is no source sheet for today. But let's look at chapter 12 of Parashat Tazria. Can someone please read from chapter 12, the whole first chapter? It's our read till you would like to pass it on to someone else, but we'd like to read the whole chapter. It's not that long, and it's quite important. So who would like to start reading?
I can do it.
Okay, thank you, Audrey.
The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the Israelite people thus. When a woman at childbirth bears a male, she shall be unclean 7 days. She shall be unclean as at the time of her menstrual infirmity. On the 8th day the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised. She shall remain in a state of blood purification for 33 days. She shall not touch any consecrated thing, nor enter the sanctuary until her period of purification is completed. If she bears a female, she shall be unclean 2 weeks as during her menstruation, and she shall remain in a state of blood purification for 66 days. On the completion of her period of purification for either son or daughter, she shall bring to the priest at the entrance of the tent of meeting a lamb in its first year for a burnt offering, and a pigeon or a turtle dove for a sin offering. He shall offer it before the Lord and make expiation on her behalf. She shall then be clean from her flow of blood. Such are the rituals concerning her who bears a child, male or female. If, however, her means do not suffice for a sheep, she shall take 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons, one for a burnt offering and the other for a sin offering. The priest shall make expiation on her behalf, and she shall be clean.
Okay, so you notice that there's a difference of time for the son and the daughter. So how do we understand this difference of length of time that a woman shall remain in a state of blood purification if she gives birth to a son or a daughter? What this means is that she remains separate from the community because she is still tme'ah, impure, 33 days and 1 week for a son, and 66 days and 2 weeks for a daughter. In actual practice, becoming tameh, excuse me. Hello, I'm in a meeting and I can't speak right now. Can you call later? Thank you. In actual practice, becoming tameh meant that the person did not enter the tent of meeting or participate in any ritual practices. And later, when it was built, the temple area, the most communal and collective of all holy spaces, she could not enter until going through a ritual of cleansing. The feminist implications of this are that impurity meant that a person was ritually unclean and therefore ineligible to enact rituals on behalf of the community or even participate in these rituals. This is the origin, much later in our Orthodox world, of prohibitions against women becoming rabbis, because the assumption was that women might be bleeding after childbirth or menstruating and therefore unclean and impure. Takes no consideration into the fact that for 3 weeks of the month, women are in a state of purity, tahor, and that postmenopausal women or infertile women who do not menstruate are always in a state of purity, except if they have had contact with a dead body, or have coupled sexually, or have had skin diseases. Rabbi Phyllis Berman offers a female and feminist perspective on tameh, impure, and tahor, which I'd like to share with you. These are Rabbi Berman's words. Out of my experience as a woman and a mother, I remember very clearly that indeed there is a period of time right after one has given birth that one wants one wants and needs to be separated from the community. Your community narrows down to the baby right in your arms and at your breast, and there isn't for some period of time another world except for that child. Then I began to think about other moments in our lives when that kind of close focused attention happens as well. Not only in childbirth, when we're lucky enough to fall in love, when we're utterly captivated in a creative process, when we are on a deep spiritual journey. With regard to childbirth, I was troubled by the difference in time of confinement for a son and a daughter. In my mothering experience, 80 days with a new child is about what I needed, perhaps what most mothers need to make that bonding happen without feeling the obligations, the responsibilities of the world at large. But I wondered what happened in the nervousness of the male community when a male child was born, whether perhaps women were forced back into the broader community more quickly with the male child than might have been their natural rhythm. Commentators on this passage have conventionally assumed that the normal time of separation was the 40 days after the birth of a boy, and have tried to explain the departure from the normal after the birth of a girl. But out of my new understanding as a mother of tahor and tameh, I saw that perhaps the real question was not, why is the isolation of a girl so long? But why is the isolation of a boy so short? Not are 80 days of separation a punishment or even a recognition of some special uncanniness arising from the birth of a birth giver, a female child, but rather are 40 days of separation an abridgment of the more natural time. Perhaps the boys are losing out, as is the mother. Notice that to reframe the question in this way not only requires being able to see female experience as normal experience, but also requires drawing on the life experience of giving birth. And let us notice that from this new perspective, we can more broadly reassess how in our own way to celebrate the sacred times that are tameh, impure, as well as those that are tahor. Rabbi Berman says that the fundamental question is, did the Israelites believe that there was a different kind of bonding that occurred between male and female and female and female? And this is why they designated different lengths of time for a woman to be isolated from the community with the son or with a daughter. Now I'm going back to my own voice. I have always wondered if this is the inception of the male bonding that occurs in biblical society, a society with which women were often excluded, from ritual, from warfare, from hunting, from the manly occupations, that even much later in the rabbinic or Talmudic era, this is the origin of the gender separations that occurred in synagogue in the late classical period, and so much more. There are also many other spiritual perspectives. Again, I return to Rabbi Jonathan Sacks. Judaism shows an acute sensitivity to the birth of a child. Nothing is more natural than procreation. Every living thing engages in it. Sociobiologists go so far as to argue that a human being is a gene's way of creating another gene. By contrast, the Torah goes to great lengths to describe how many of the heroines of the Bible, among them Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, Hannah, and the Shunammite woman, were infertile and had children only through a miracle. Clearly, the Torah intends a message here, and it is unmistakable. To be a Jew is to know that survival is not a matter of biology alone. What other cultures may take as natural childbirth is for us a miracle. Every Jewish child is a gift of God. No faith has taken children more seriously or devoted more of its efforts to raising the next generation, perhaps because it was so hard to do so. Childbirth is wondrous. To be a parent is the closest any of us come to God Himself. That, incidentally, is why in our tradition, and this is an Orthodox perspective, women are closer to God than men, because they, unlike men, know what it is to bring new life out of themselves as God brings life out of Himself. The idea is beautifully captured in the verse in which, leaving Eden, Adam turns to his wife and calls her Chava, for she is the mother of all life. We can now speculate about the laws relating to childbirth. When a woman gives birth, not only does she undergo great risk, she is also separated from what until now has been part of her own body. A fetus, said the rabbis, is like a limb of the mother, and which has now become an independent person. If that is so, in the case of a boy, it is doubly so in the case of a girl, who with God's help will not merely live, but may herself in later years become a source of new life. At one level, therefore, the laws signal the detachment of life from life. On another level, they surely suggest something more profound. There is a halachic principle. One who is engaged in a mitzvah is exempt from other mitzvot. It is as if God were saying to the mother, for 40 days in the case of the boy, and doubly so in the case of the girl, the mother-daughter bond is ontologically stronger than that between mother and son. I exempt you from coming before me in the place of holiness because you are fully engaged in one of the holiest acts of all, nurturing and caring for your child. Unlike others, you do not need to visit the temple to be attached to life in all its sacred splendor. You are experiencing it yourself, directly and with every fiber of your being. Days, weeks from now, you will come and give thanks to me. But for now, look upon your child with wonder, for you have been given a glimpse of the great secret, otherwise known only to God. Childbirth exempts the new mother from attendance at the temple because her bedside replicates the experience of the temple. Her bedside replicates the experience of the temple. She now knows what is for love to beget life to beget life, and in the midst of mortality to be touched by the intimation of immortality. Now I say there is an extra blessing in the time of life-giving woman a mother enjoys with her potentially life-giving daughter. And similarly, men are blessed in bringing their sons into the fraternity of men. I wonder, however, about the shortness of the time, as does Rabbi Berman, of the shortness of the time that a woman has with her son. So let's stop there and let's consider, and please join me in the consideration. Do or can we have in our own, there are two questions. One is, do or can we have different definitions of purity and impurity in our own times? What does it mean to be pure or impure in our times that would be quite different from the biblical definitions? And second, what do we think of the gender bonding issues that Torah presents to us? And I'm going to open it up now for whichever of those you'd like to tackle in whatever order you'd like to tackle them.
Bob has his hand up, Layla. Bob
Yes,
Singer.
Bob.
Hi, I wanted to comment that early on in my training as a family doctor, I worked with a brilliant psychologist who studied how children develop concepts of illness. And I came to realize that there are many adults who never get past childhood conceptions. And basically, they organized it in 3 steps, something called pre-logical, which was contagion. The idea that a child might feel like if they're near someone else who's sick, they might get it. The second level was concrete, which is contamination, not just being near someone, but actually touching them somehow as a transfer of the illness. The feeling that if you're touching someone with cancer, you might get cancer. And there are adults who believe that emotionally, whether they believe that intellectually or not. And the highest level is, the psychophysiological that, we use in modern medicine. But I think some of this has to do with the biblical, prohibitions about contact with blood. And somehow this feeling that it's best not to be in contact with blood for, a variety of spiritual reasons, and sort of equating women with blood and sort of misinterpreting that whole idea about, being contaminated by something. And my sense is that the blood is actually holy, but it somehow got converted into an idea about something which is the opposite of holy, that it's impure in some way. And the original idea be to be careful about being in contact with something of great holiness, and it turned into something that you ought to avoid must be something that's dirty. It's almost that the mitzvot that came about around this sort of misinterpreted the meaning of what blood meant spiritually.
I think you are onto something there. I wouldn't say that they saw it as dirty. I think they saw it more as having so much power that it might have destructive properties to it. Remember that in the sacrifice, the blood is spattered on the 4 corners of the altar, and the priests inevitably got blood on them, and they were impervious to it. But the simple person, the non-priestly person, is to stay far away from the altar when this is going on. And the blood force is considered to be, as we know, the life-giving force. If we don't have blood, we can't survive. And for them, woman's blood, whether it's menstrual blood or the blood of childbirth, is so powerful that it's considered to be something that could overwhelm the person who might come into contact with it. What's interesting about that, though, is that there is a whole culture of midwifery. And what's not talked about at all is the fact that the midwives, too, are then considered to be unclean and have to be isolated at the same time. Now, I actually think that's a really great thing, because then there's a sisterhood around the woman to care for her and to be with her during this time. So I see 2 hands up. We'll go to Camilla and then to Ralph.
I just have a quick question, and that is, your idea that the blood is really thought of as powerful and not dirty, but then why do we have this word unclean? Are we translating it? I mean, is there something in the word that will help us if
Well, the
understand that better?
translation is not a good one. It should say pure or impure, rather than clean or unclean. It definitely, the word in Hebrew is tameh or tahor, meaning pure or impure. And and why? Because contact with it would make someone impure. And both words are problematic because they imply moral what's the word I'm looking for? Um, a moral sin in some way. They imply maldoing, doing something wrong. Um, and because, as I said at the beginning, in the earlier part of my talk, um, in later years, um, the leaders of Judaism, the rabbis, made this distinction between the verbal and ethical sins that also made one impure. The suggestion was that during biblical times, the impurities that someone could contract were ethical, but that wasn't the intention. The intention was purely situational. In other words, let's take it out of the realm of blood. Let's take it in my house wasn't built very well, and it was a rainy season, and suddenly there was mildew on the walls, and I touched the walls, and I became impure because of touching the walls, and I had to be purified by that. That wasn't considered to be an ethical or a moral thing at all. I was impure, and I needed to be cleansed, and I needed to be separated for a certain period of time so that my impurity could be cleansed. But there was no moral malfeasance attached to that. And the same way, the woman's blood, either menstrual blood or childbirth blood, was not considered to be a result of malfeasance. What is problematic for feminists is that in later years, this got transferred into such things as saying that a woman couldn't serve on the bima, that a woman couldn't be a rabbi, that a woman couldn't lead because she was impure because of her blood.
So if I understood you rightly, you said the rabbis added on this that the moral laws would make you. That was totally rabbinical. There's nothing in
There's
the
nothing
text.
in the Bible about that.
Oh, that's interesting. Thank you. Okay, I'll be quiet now.
Don't have to be quiet. Your questions are good ones. Ralph?
Yeah, I just wanted to connect this to the laws of kashrut, where we take care when we prepare meat to drain as much of the blood out as we can. And I'll even throw in the respect we have for a mother's, at least the cow's milk is kind of a nurturing environment. And that gets in the laws of kashrut too. And I was also wondering, does the Bible make any reference to the term bloodlines, or is that a metaphor that is a lot more after the Bible?
Well, there are the bloodlines of the tribes, that being a member of a particular tribe is very, very important. So if you're a member of a certain tribe and you leave that tribe, it's not considered to be great. They want you to stay within the tribe. But back to the issue of blood, that's why in the laws of kashrut, if you crack open an egg and there's a spot of blood in it, it's not kosher. You have to discard the egg. Everything that has blood in it in a way that is not naturally there. I mean, of course there's blood in meat even after we drain it, and that's considered to be okay. You can't get every bit of blood out of a drained piece of meat, so that's acceptable. But to drain it as much as possible is definitely the way. But that goes back to Noah, because when God gave permission, remember that we were vegetarians, in the Garden of Eden, and before the flood, there was no permission to eat animals. And it was only after the flood, when God speaks to Noah and his sons, that we are given permission to eat meat. And that's where the admonition to not eat the blood, and that's where the law of kashrut comes from, to drain the blood. And most people have interpreted that as being about saying, don't take the blood of the animal so cavalierly that you would think that from taking the blood of the animal you might shed human blood. In other words, don't equate the blood of the animal as being so cheap or so irrelevant that if you eat a bloody piece of meat, then blood is not valuable and cherished and precious and powerful. Get rid of as much of it as you possible so you can value and understand the power of blood, and don't you dare ever shed the blood of a human being. Value it. And it's only then that we start, that's the origin of the law of kashrut, and it's also the origin of the blood ethics concerning human beings. And those who study sacrifice say that it's also the beginning of the teachings about human sacrifice as well. There's a very interesting book, not by a biblical scholar, Carol Delaney, who she is a biblical scholar. It's called The Trial of Abraham, where she talks about sacrifice, and how sacrifice has, human sacrifice, and how there were admonitions against human sacrifice early on in our tradition. And she points to the Noah story, and she points, of course, to the Akedah and to other places. She then goes on sociologically to talk about the whole issue of not sacrifice in the literal sense, but child abuse and other things sociologically, which is, it's a very interesting book. The Carol Delaney, The Trial of Abraham. Malka, I see your hand up.
Yes, what struck me was that the woman is unclean, whether she menstruates so therefore she's not gonna give birth. And then she's unclean, or I understand it's not unclean, it's
Impure.
impure. When she does give birth, she's like impure if she does or she doesn't.
That's right. The extension of the category of impurity is there, and that's why this notion that there are 3 weeks after she's given childbirth and she goes back to her normal cycle. There are 3 weeks of the month when she's entirely pure, when she's not menstruating or anything else. But the later rabbis, we never know when the woman is menstruating, so therefore we have to assume from that she's going to be impure the entire time. She's not going to tell us when she's menstruating, and it has been a very, very prejudicial element in the permission or the rights of women to be on the bima, to lead services, etc. And it's very interesting, even today, where we do have Orthodox female rabbis who are known as Maharat. There are very, very specific things that the Maharat cannot do because of the assumption of menstruation. I couldn't tell you all of them, but they still take that into consideration. Right. Yes, Jerry. You're muted. You're muted, Jerry. Jerry, you're muted. Jerry,
I didn't raise my hand, or I'm sorry.
What I had was.
Oh, different Jerry. Sir.
Oh,
I'm sorry, Jerry Ehrenstein.
thank you. I was going to ask, now that we have the possibility of using blood medically when people need it. Are any of these rules adapted for that problem?
You know, I don't know. I don't know factually about that. But I do know that the laws concerning women remain. So, and you know, that's interesting. You now got me on a search. I'm going to check that out because I would imagine there would be new thinking on the whole question of blood. And what would be interesting to me now would be in the Orthodox or ultra Orthodox world, how would an individual be categorized who gave blood? And would that individual, male or female, be considered to be in a state of tameh, of tuma, after having given blood for a certain period of time because the blood was outside of their body? I don't know, but that's a fascinating question. Thank you. So what do you think about the whole question of the parental bonding and the different lengths of time? Anybody have? Yes, Camilla.
Well, I just had one little thing that I noticed that I thought was interesting is that it seems like if you look at the text, it seems like they make sure the mother's okay to go to the bris. It's like she's unclean for 7 days. Then they say there's the bris, and then they say she shall remain in a state of blood purification for 33 days. So it's almost like they don't set, that they're saying you shouldn't separate the mother on the day of the birth from the baby.
Is that what it says? I'm not
Well,
sure.
it says it to me. I mean, you can argue against it.
Let's look what it says. She shall be unclean 7 days. She shall be unclean at the time of her menstrual infirmity. On the 8th day, the flesh of his forehead she shall remain. I'm not sure that we can read it that she's actually at the bris.
I guess I'm being optimistic about the males there.
I think you're being aspirational. My sense is that she's not there. That this is a fraternity of men bringing the son into the covenant, but she's tme'ah. She is in a state of impurity, and she's not there.
But why did they say 7 days then?
Well,
The first
but
line.
notice with the boy, it also says if let's look at the boy.
That was the boy. It was for the boy.
Right, but then she goes on to who brings the bagels and the lox. This is a very serious question. But then with the girl, it says she shall remain unclean for 2 weeks, and then I think it's debatable. I think it's debatable as to whether she's there or not. I don't think that she's there, but. Now I have to ask my colleagues about that one too. But I think that it's designating a week and then the 66 days.
I just thought it was interesting that it was a week for the male and 2 weeks for female. And why is that?
Excuse me, a week and then 33 days for the male.
But then there's the line about the bris, right, in between those two phrases.
Right, but I still think that you're being aspirational. I think your feminist consciousness is here, that the mommy is there, but I don't think so. I don't think so. Yes, Nancy.
Well, in reference to this issue about the week or the 2 weeks and then the rest of the days, I'm in the mechanics of it. I think after you give birth, you're still bleeding for a while. I mean, you're literally bleeding, right, for a week or two. I mean, depending on. So I'm thinking that maybe that's the period that they're, the time period that they're talking about. But then you're still unclean or impure for this other amount of time where you may not actually be bleeding at that point, but you're still in this, phase. But I guess two comments that come to mind. I've always thought in that maybe, some of the early reasons for why there was so much prejudice prejudice against women by men is really, the feeling that the birth process is so powerful and so amazing, that and that men just felt like they needed to kind of control it in some way and make it because otherwise it's a very powerful a moment, and I just felt like men have tried to sort of put women down to sort of raise their own sense of power in this process. So and then the idea of bringing the male into the male group that earlier time to sort of not let him get contaminated by too much by the mother. But having only had two boys and no daughters, I can't really speak exactly to sort of this difference between this gender bonding. But my feeling as a mom of two boys is that in some ways they needed me more as youngsters. I think I got the sense that girls are easier to sort of deal with when they're young, and it's almost more as they got older, girls become more difficult to deal with and boys are more easy. So in some ways it seems like the boys needed more time with the mom earlier. So it strikes me as reverse of what needed to happen in reality. So my observation.
I only had a daughter, so I don't know. But I do want to say that I don't think that the men were trying to put the women down. I think it's more the first point that you made, that the process of childbirth was so filling for them that they were just so filled with awe at this, that the power of it and the blood went together in some way, and that they needed to they felt that they needed to isolate, but it wasn't coming from them, it was coming from God, and they perceived it as coming from God. Bob, I'm sorry that I need to say no because our time is almost over. I wanted to finish, since this is our last time together, about Tazria, with a poem by my dear friend and colleague, Professor Laurie Patton, who is the president of Middlebury College, and she was I was her mikvah lady when she converted to Judaism many, many years ago, and she has written a volume called Angel's Task, which is a volume with a poem for each parsha. And this one was for Tazria. It takes time to clean and wrap leprous bandages. Elijah told the rabbi that the Messiah was a leper sitting at the gates of the city, bandaging his wounds one at a time. Ah, said the rabbi, he is being thorough. He is taking his time. No, said Elijah. This way the Messiah can come any time he is called, and he will not be delayed. He would rush out, no time for cover or cleaning. What is one open sore when the moment has come to close the wounds of the world? One of the great midrashim of Mashiach Zeit, Messiah time, is indeed that the Messiah has tzara'at and is sitting at the gates of Rome, waiting to heal the entire world. So with the prayer that the terrible wounds of our world will be healed soon, I say goodbye to you and thank you for giving me the opportunity to teach you.
Layla, I want to, from everyone here, from the bottom of my heart and everyone's heart, thank you for for offering such wonderful wisdom for these past few months. You have filled up our Wednesdays at noon in a way that I was hoping would happen, and you did it beautifully. So thank you.
And I
And
look
hopefully,
forward to future opportunities to teach with adults.
absolutely, absolutely. So we're all going to take a break on Wednesdays now for a little while. I give you back your Wednesdays at noon, but we will be meeting again. I believe it's May 4th for Parsha Amor, and Rabbi Rachel will be back with us. Tomorrow night, if you haven't yet come, join us for the second session and last session with Jerome Kapolsky on Samuel. We'll be talking about David. It was a fascinating conversation last week, so you don't have to have come before, but do try to make it tomorrow at 7:30. So anyway, thank you, everybody, and have a lovely rest of your week.
Yeah, and Rabbi Leila, can I especially thank you for the scholar? I was realizing in this session, the generous scholarship when you prepare and just lay things out, and you were going on for half that. I mean, we're just so privileged that we really appreciate that.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much.